All right, guys, let's talk about Thor: Love and Thunder. Look, this is the 29th film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the fourth Thor movie starring Chris Hemsworth. With the team is back, right? These are people that we've met in Ragnarok and other parts of the MCU. So Tessa Thompson's back as now King Valkyrie. Natalie Portman is back as Jane Foster. We'll get into her a lot more in this review. And Taika Waititi obviously directing this, but also co-starring in this as Korg. Look, and then obviously there's the introduction of Christian Bale as Gorr the God Butcher. So the film, we'll talk about sort of the general premise, and then I'll talk about my thoughts on it. The general premise here is that we meet Gorr the God Butcher, or just Gorr, who is just this being on some planet who sees significant loss in his life. Things are very bleak for him. I'll just say that. And he's praying to whatever God he believes in, and he eventually finds that God on his planet. And the God is like very dismissive of him. Like, oh, who cares? Like, nobody cares about your problems. And when that happens, it sort of mentally breaks him. And then he ends up killing this god with this thing called the Necro Sword that he finds. And that kind of sets him off on this path of wanting to kill all gods because they are, according to him, just miserable and don't really help people and do the things that they promise to do. And, you know, people sacrifice themselves and pray to them with no benefit, right? So it is about a man losing his faith and sort of setting off on this very destructive journey. At the same time, sort of parallel to that, we meet up with Jane Foster, who we haven't seen since Thor: The Dark World, played by Natalie Portman, obviously. And she is in a situation where she is dying of cancer. This is not really a spoiler because this is like pretty well-known comic stuff. She's dying of cancer, and she picks up Mjolnir through a series of events. And so she's set off as the mighty Thor. Meanwhile, Chris Hemsworth's Thor that we've known since the beginning of the MCU, he's sort of in the middle of a existential crisis, right? After losing his brother for the third or fourth time, and just sort of losing all of his friends in Endgame and everything else. He's at this sort of like weird crossroads in his life where he just kind of doesn't really want to fight anymore. He's just kind of done with it. He's fighting, but he's not the Thor that like we're used to seeing, right? He's just kind of like, all right, I'll do it, but I don't really want to. Kind of want to take this path of like peace or what have you, right? To some extent. And that's kind of where we kind of drop in on all the characters. The thing about this movie is, one, this was written, co-written and directed by Taika Waititi, who did Thor Ragnarok, which I thoroughly enjoyed, actually. This one I thought was okay. It's fine. The big issue for me is the sort of disappointment in the storytelling and how less than tight I think the writing is, actually. Which is surprising for Taika Waititi project. Like, he's very good at melding comedy and seriousness quite well. And also he's an expert storyteller, right? Go see Jojo Rabbit if you want a prime example of that. Taking something that's very serious, putting a slight comedy spin on it, but then still having these underpinnings of a very serious thing. In this one, it feels like the comedy is sort of overtaking any sense of like a real heavy story. Which it should be a heavy story. You have one of the heroes who is fighting off cancer to survive and, you know, fighting, and also like quite legitimately fighting the bad guy, right? Alongside, another hero. And then you also have this man who has kind of fallen from his faith and he's kind of set off on this like weird, very dark, destructive path. It doesn't have to be hyper self-serious. Like I'm not looking for that, but it felt like the comedy a lot of times undercut parts that I thought were rather supposed to be considered rather serious. It's an enjoyable movie. It's a fun time largely, but the parts of the project are far superior than the project as a whole, right? All of the performances are good. Hemsworth back as Thor, he's great. Like, he knows that role. He has just enough seriousness and just enough comedy to like kind of nail it. Jane Foster's character, played by Natalie Portman again, is really quite good. I actually liked her performance a lot as this sort of conflicted character. Look, Christian Bale's performance as Gorr the God Butcher is awesome. Like, he's really good. Like, the talk of, is he going to be considered his performance as one of the better villains of the MCU? Yeah, I would say that's fairly accurate. But the problem is, it's sort of the undercutting of all of the, like, goofball comedy aspects. And, like, there is goofball comedy in other MCU movies, like Thor Ragnarok. There's comedy there. But in this, it becomes a little too much. It makes the narrative feel very uneven to me. Look, I think that if you are a hardcore MCU fan, you'll find a lot of things about it that you like. But I can certainly see why some people would be like, kind of like, it was okay, right? And I would tend to say that's a completely reasonable perspective. I know that everybody is going to have a certain, or a lot of people are going to have a certain affinity for certain characters, I'll put them in quotes, that are introduced in this movie. I found the joke to be funny maybe the first couple of times, but there is a sort of a recurring joke that gets really annoying to me. And I think, like, when I left the theater, hearing people say, like, that was the thing that that was their number one thing that they took away from the film, to me says a lot about how much it was shown, and like it undercuts so much of what the important narrative of that film is. Like, you quite literally have one of the heroes and one of the villains, their journeys mirroring each other, and like what that looks like and where they kind of end up in the end is super interesting, and actually has a lot to say about how similar these villains and heroes truly are, like their underpinnings, what they truly are. So I have to say, I am a little disappointed that that Taika Waititi didn't nail the storytelling as tightly as I thought he did in Ragnarok. It's far from like, if you're reading this as like, oh, it's a horrible movie, I shouldn't see it. No, I don't think that's true. But I do think if you liked Ragnarok, I think you might find that this is a little bit lacking. Now, things like real things that I thought worked quite well. The action sequences are pretty good. They're kind of fun. There's a couple of cameos and things like that. Like throughout the story that I think are really good. The one of the mid-credit scenes is a really good one. Like especially if you watch a certain other thing, like you'll recognize why it's kind of a big deal. Which is kind of a fun. I think it sets up a sort of a fun future story at some point. Look, Thor: Love and Thunder is, again, it's fine. I don't think it's in the upper echelon of MCU movies, nor do I think it's one of the worst. I think it feels very much somewhere in the middle. For me, again, I was a little disappointed in the sort of unevenness of the storytelling. I just did not feel that, like, there were certain serious moments where I'm like, all right, cool, like we're in it. Like, there is a moment as we're moving into the third act where, like, the third act is like, this is what we come for, man. We come for the big action sequences. We come for, like, the villains giving their, like, here's my speech and like let's rock and roll, let's fight it out kind of thing. And it's undercut at the beginning of that moment. So, like, you're weirdly starting what should be this very serious third act. You're undercutting it with comedy, and it feels, it's so undercut that you kind of, like, you can, I at least for me, my audience, like, they were still laughing at that other thing that happened at the beginning of the third act, that when the serious part is, like, moving along, like, they're still chuckling about that. And it's like, yeah, we're past it, but, like, let's pay attention to what's going on here. So, like, to me, as a writing perspective, like, you have the serious moment, and as it's like, oh, wow, that was, like, really heavy. Then you bring out a little bit of levity at the end to kind of bring people back, going, finishing out the film. But it was like a weird reversal of that. So, again, not the best that they've done, hardly anywhere close to the worst thing that they've done, but it feels very much in the middle. So, again, Thor: Love and Thunder, it's fine. It's fine. So I would say, if you're not dying to go to the theater because of, like, COVID or whatever, it's not the worst idea to, like, you could wait. Like, you could wait. Like, honestly, I could have waited. Like, to me, it didn't have the same impact, like, leaving as Multiverse of Madness had or any of the other stuff. But it's fine. It's okay. So, from my score, it's a 3.5 out of 5. We'll see you guys next time.